God's Word tonight and open to 2 Kings in the Old Testament. 2 Kings. And tonight we're going to look at chapter 3. And we're going to look at this whole chapter here. This whole narrative is one full story that hopefully we'll learn some principles that will be helpful for us. And I'm going to read just a few verses here in this chapter as we start off. 2 Kings 3, verse 16. And he said, "Thus saith the Lord, make this valley full of ditches. For thus saith the Lord, ye shall not see wind, neither shall ye see rain. Yet that valley shall be filled with water, that ye may drink, both ye and your cattle and your beasts." So tonight I want to talk about make your valley full of ditches. Making your valley full of ditches. You know, there are many useful lessons we can learn from this narrative if we had the time. But for our study tonight, I just want to give you one big idea from this whole story. And that's this: where you turn in a time of crisis reveals a lot about your spiritual commitment and your faith in God. When a crisis or an emergency comes into your life, where do you turn? Now, the books of 1st and 2nd Kings are about kings, obviously. But all these stories kind of have a common denominator. They're all about kings who failed in some way. They made bad decisions. And because of the bad decisions they made a mess of things. And because of that, they were in a very difficult situation. The story here is no different. It teaches us that we cannot really place our faith in earthly kings, but rather we put all of our hope in the King of Kings. Now, what we learn from the narrative, the big picture of 1st and 2nd Kings, is that all these kings fail, but we have to be ready for the real king, the King of Kings, to come, Jesus, who will never fail. And that's really something that we have to keep in mind as we study all these stories. These stories all point to the one coming king, the son of David, the Lord Jesus Christ. But what we have here in this story is we have several kings, and we're going to see how each of them responds to a crisis. But the first crisis I want you to see is really what I call a supply chain crisis. Does that sound familiar? So the story opens up. Look in chapter 3, and we're going to look at verse 5 here, but just let me give you a little background into what's going on. So for years, Misha, is the king of Moab. Moab is a pagan nation. And for years, Misha, the king of Moab, has been giving tribute, or paying taxes, you could say, to the king of Israel. That's because earlier they were conquered. When you're conquered, you become a vassal king. You give tribute to the authoritative king, the overseeing nation. Now, the tribute was, according to 2 Kings 3:4, because Misha and the people of Moab were keepers of sheep, every year they would give 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with wool. So that's a lot. But something happened. Suddenly, they were no longer paying the tribute that they once paid. And look in chapter 3, look down at verse number 5. It says, "And it came to pass when Ahab was dead that the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel." So the king of Moab, when Ahab died, saw this as an opportunity for him to no longer pay this hefty tribute. And so he got tired of paying it. He said, "I'm not going to pay this anymore." Now think about that. The nation of Israel now is losing 200,000 sheep a year. That would be a serious blow on the economy, especially on the wool industry. It was a threat to the whole economic stability of Israel. Something had to be done. And so the king of the Moabites, Misha, he had to be put in his place. So notice what happens in verse 6. And the king Jehoram went out of Samaria the same time and numbered all Israel. So that is, he's gathering up his army. He decides he's going to go into battle against the king of the Moabites. If he refuses to pay, we're just going to have to go down there and we're going to have to get our taxes. We're going to have to get our tribute. And so he's going to go to war. Now, to help ensure victory, Jehoram requests help from the king of the southern kingdom, which is Jehoshaphat. And look down at verse number 7. And he went and sent unto Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, "The king of Moab hath rebelled against me. Wilt thou go with me against Moab to battle?" And he said, "I will go up. I am as thou art, and my people is thy people, and my horses is thy horses." And so Jehoshaphat is a very gracious, godly king. And he says, "Of course I'll go. Of course I'll help." And so now we have these two nations working together, the northern tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, the southern tribes of Judah. Now they come together and they're united and they're going to go march off to battle against the Moabites. And along the way, they were going to pick up another king with them. Since the king of Edom was a vassal king, they decided they would enlist him as well and get his army to join. And so they did that. And verse 8, and he said, which way shall we go? Up. And he answered, the way through the wilderness of Edom. And so the king of Israel went, and the king of Judah, and the king of Edom, and they fetched a compass of 7 days' journey. And so here they are. Now on the way, they pick up another member of the coalition. And now they have 3 nations that have come together, 3 kings and their armies, and they're marching off to battle. They had planned everything, at least they thought they did. They were united in this coalition of armies. They had their strategy. It was going to be a surprise attack. They decided the exact route that they were going to go. They planned it all out. And so here they are. They're on this grand campaign, and they think that they're going to be victorious, but there was a problem. Look down at verse 9. So the king of Israel went, and the king of Judah and the king of Edom, and they fetched a compass of 7 days' journey. Now here's the next part. And there was no water for the hosts and for the cattle that follow them. 7 days into this march, what happens? They run out of water. Oh, that's not a good thing. This is a genuine emergency because they were marching through a really hot, dry desert. They took the long circular route down towards the lower end of the Dead Sea. You know, they were hoping to kind of sneak up on the Moabites. And so they take this longer than usual journey. And someone in the planning stage forgot to plan for enough water, to make sure everybody had enough water. Now, these guys were probably patting themselves on the back as they were marching, 3 or 4 days into the journey. But, wow, this is going to be wonderful. This is going to be great. But on the 7th day, they ran out of water. And this is just really just bad planning. This is poor leadership. This puts them in a vulnerable position. It's more than likely Jehoram's fault because this whole plan was really his. And so because of a foolish king, there's a supply chain crisis. Again, does that sound familiar? The armies of 3 nations had no water, and they were on the brink of extinction. And so what starts out as this grand military conquest turns into a death march. I love what Spurgeon wrote at this point, talking about this narrative. He said, in vain your shields, O ye mighty, in vain your banners, ye valiant hosts. The armies must perish painfully, perish without exception, all for want of so simple but so necessary a thing as water. Man would fain play the God, and yet a little water will lay him low. So true. Now, what would you do? This is a crisis, a genuine crisis. Where do you turn when an emergency or a crisis hits? And again, remember the major point I'm trying to make here. Where you turn to in a time of crisis speaks a lot about where you are spiritually and your faith in God. So I want you to notice in this narrative 3 different responses to a crisis. And they're really going to be modeled for us by these kings. Number 1, some people blame God. That's one response. Some people simply blame God. And really, Jehoram is an example of this. He blames it all on God. God, you did this. God, this was your fault. It's all of you. Now, let's learn a little bit about Jehoram. Who is he? I want you to see, first of all, his wicked family. Back up to verse number 1. Let's find out who he is. Now, Jehoram, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel and Samaria. So here's what we learn. He is the son of the wicked king Ahab and Queen Jezebel. So he grew up in an ungodly, idolatrous family. So he doesn't have a whole lot going for him there. He hasn't learned to really put faith in God from them, that's for sure, because they were trying to replace God with Baal worship. So we see his wicked family, but also we're going to see his wavering faith. Because look down at verse number 2. And he wrought evil in the sight of the Lord, but not like his father and like his mother, for he had put away the image of Baal that his father had made. Now, the writer of Kings says, he was wicked, but he wasn't as bad as his father. His father Ahab was much worse. How do we know that? Well, because he put away the image of Baal that his father had made. This was a statue that his father erected in the temple that he had built for Baal. And Jehoram comes along and he puts it away. That means he puts it into a closet. He doesn't destroy it. He just puts it someplace into a storage room. Now, how do we know that? Because later on in 2 Kings, it's going to reappear. So he doesn't destroy it. He just sets it aside. You know, a lot of people treat sin the way Jehoram treats that image. They don't actually destroy their sin. They don't forsake their sin. They don't mortify their sin. They just put it in the closet of their heart. And we'll refer to it later. And so what we see here is out of Jehoram is he's kind of a half-hearted follower. And really you couldn't call him a follower, but if he is somewhat a follower of God, he's half-hearted. He's double-minded. And on one hand, he removes this image, but on the other hand, he allows people to worship pagan idols. Even though he doesn't participate in Baal worship himself, he tolerates it. And again, later on, when Jehu comes to the throne, he will discover this image and he will destroy it. But we see a half-hearted kind of following from Jehoram. And let me tell you something. If you're going to follow God, God doesn't want half-hearted followers. He wants wholehearted followers. Jehoram was kind of like the rest of the people in Israel, if you remember when Elijah said, how long halt ye between two opinions? If Baal's God, follow him. If Yahweh is God, follow him. Jehoram was kind of trying to half following Baal and half following God. And his heart was really not where it needed to be. And there are a lot of Christians that are just like that. They're trying to get one foot in the world and they got one foot in church. They're kind of half-hearted in their following of God. And God doesn't use or need half-hearted followers. God wants wholehearted followers. I think about the allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress. There was one character that John Bunyan has in that story called the Mr. Facing Both Ways. Mr. Facing Both Ways. He had the impossible task of trying to face Christ, the way towards Christ, and then the world. You can't do that. And again, this is what Jehoram is like. God doesn't want half-hearted followers. And by the way, I think people like that, where they're trying to live in the world and yet call themselves a Christian, I think that these people are not really believers. You say, why do you say that? That's kind of harsh. Well, because the Bible says that the one telltale sign of a true believer is what? It's obedience. Obedience to Christ. If you're not obeying Jesus, if that's not the pattern of your life, you need to examine your salvation. Jesus said, why do you call me Lord and don't do the things that I say? Why do you claim to be a follower of me and you're not listening to me? You're not following me. You're not obeying me. And so here was Jehoram. He's half-hearted. He's double-minded. Ralph Davis in his commentary describes him like this. He said he was not as wicked as he could have been, yet he was not as righteous as he should have been. James describes a double-minded man. Remember what he said? A double-minded man is what? Unstable in all his ways. And on one hand, he's up. The other hand, he's down. He described him kind of like being a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. And what happens when a crisis comes to a double-minded person? Usually unbelief triumphs in that situation. That's exactly what happened to Jehoram. And so what does he do? He starts blaming God. Look at verse number 10 of chapter 3. And the king of Israel said, alas, that the Lord hath called these three kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. Notice what he says here. Oh, the Lord has called these three kings together because he wants to kill us. Wait a minute, Jehoram. Whose idea was this? This was your idea, wasn't it? And now here he is. He's blaming it all on God. We're all going to die. It's God who is doing this. And Jehoram is an example of the kind of person who always is blaming God for their troubles. He hardly thinks about God all during the week, but as soon as things go wrong, he starts blaming God. And there are people like that all over. And again, he lays it at the feet of God. Alas, the Lord has called these kings together to deliver them. Again, there's people like this all over. When things are going well, they don't really think about God. They don't give God credit. They don't acknowledge God for all the blessings. But you let something go wrong, and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is God, followed by a string of curses. They curse God's name. Stop blaming God for your mistakes. So this leads to the next idea, his wicked family, his wavering faith, but then his willful folly. Again, this was not God's doing. This was Jehoram's fault. It was his own foolishness. Right in your margin, Proverbs 19:3, Solomon had a word on this. He said, the foolishness of man perverts his way, and his heart frets against the Lord. I love the way the ESV translates this. When a man's folly brings him his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. That describes exactly what's happening here with Jehoram. His own folly brought him on this path, And now he's raging against God. Now he's blaming God. But it was all really his fault because he made some bad decisions and he was in a mess. First of all, this was a proud decision. Why did he go marching off in the first place? Was he doing it for the glory of God? No, it's because he wanted money. He wanted tribute money. And his pride was hurt that this king no longer was paying tribute. He was really materially minded. He wasn't doing it for the glory of God, but for the glory of himself. It was a proud decision. It was a presumptuous decision because he just assumed that God was going to bless him. I mean, he made his own plan in verse number 8. They said, which way shall we go? And he answered, the way through the wilderness of Edom. He had it all figured out on his own. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go through Edom. We're going to give a surprise attack. We'll pick up another king there. We'll be too strong to defeat. This is all going to be great. So he makes his own plan, and then he says he expects God to rubber stamp that plan as if, God is subject to his wishes. A lot of people are just like that. Rather than asking the Lord what to do, they come up with their own plan and they expect God to just approve it. God, you do this. It reminds me of the man in James who said, go to now, either say today or tomorrow, we'll go into such a city and buy and sell and get gain. What is your life? He says, you know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It's like a vapor that appears for a little time and vanishes away. You're making all of your plans in a spirit of self-sufficiency and pride, and you expect God just to check off on all that you're doing, but you don't know what tomorrow holds. That's why you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll do this or we'll do that. This was a presumptuous decision. This was a prayerless decision. We don't see him anywhere praying and asking God for direction. He wasn't seeking God at all. And the Bible says, in all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Now, I love Elisha in this story because Elisha is going to rebuke him. Look down at verse 13. And Elisha said unto the king of Israel, what have I to do with thee? Get thee to the prophets of thy father and to the prophets of thy mother. And the king of Israel said unto him, nay, for the Lord hath called these three kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. It's repeating the same thing. He comes to Elisha for help, and Elisha says, go to your prophets. Go to the prophets of your father and your mother. By the way, you remember who Baal is? He's the God of what? Rain and water. Shouldn't you be talking to him if he's God? But he goes back to his old line. Oh, no, God's brought us together because God wants to kill us. God wants to hurt us. It's all God's fault. Jehoram needed to repent and humble himself. But instead, he just continues to blame God. If you're in a crisis because you didn't pray or you didn't seek God before a decision and you made your own plans and you just expect God to check off on them and now you're in a mess, stop blaming God. You know what you need to do? Humble yourself before the Lord and go to the Lord and say, God, forgive me and help me. Some people blame God. But now here's number 2. Some people depend on their own resources. Now, we're going to look at another king in this story. He's an example of what not to do in a crisis as well. His name is Misha, the king of Moab. And really, we see his crisis more at the end of the chapter. He's going to be completely defeated and routed by Israel. So look down in verse number 24 of chapter 3. And when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and smote the Moabites, so that they fled before them, but they went forth smiting the Moabites even in their country. And they beat down the cities on every good piece of land and cast every man his stone and filled it. And they stopped all the waters of well and felled all the good trees. Only in Kirith Hareseth left they the stones thereof. Howbeit the slingers went about it and smote it. And so what's happening here? Misha and his army were completely defeated. It was just a slaughter. Not only was his army annihilated, but his enemies also scorched the earth. It says here they destroyed every field in Moab. They destroyed every fountain there in Moab. You talk about a crisis. Now, how does Misha respond? This is his crisis. His crisis is the enemies come in and they have slaughtered his army and his fields and his fountains are ruined. What does he do? Does he pray to the living God? Does he seek God? No, he tries to deal with this on his own. And again, this is what some people do. When a crisis comes, Some people just rely on their own strength or their own wisdom or their own resources. So look in verse number 26. And when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, he took with him 700 men that drew swords to break through even unto the king of Edom, but they could not. So he rounds up 700 of his finest soldiers, his best swordsmen, but even this skilled army was unable to succeed. You know, we might think that we're strong enough to handle anything, but you know what? A crisis reveals just how weak we really are, that we don't really have the strength. And so when this effort fails, Misha comes up with another idea. What he would do now is he would make a sacrifice to his god, Chemosh. So notice what happens down in verse 27. Then he took his eldest son that should have reigned in his stead and offered him for a burnt offering upon the wall. Wow, can you imagine that? He offers his son as a burnt offering, as a sacrifice to his God. That's incredible. In an ancient text called the Misha inscription, the Moabites attributed all their disasters to the anger of their God, saying this, for Chemosh was angry with this land or his land. So apparently Misha believed that his human sacrifice would appease the god Chemosh. And really what he was doing is he was handing his son over to Satan, because that's all it was, pagan worship. When people would sacrifice their children to idols, they were sacrificing them to Satan. And kings did that in ancient times. But still, it was a shock for the people of Moab to see their crown prince bleeding to death on the city wall. This was a horrendous sight. It angered the Moabites. And the Israelites, when they saw this, it mortified them as well. And the Bible says in verse 27, they just simply returned to their own land. They departed. So on the surface, it might have looked like Misha's plan worked. I mean, Israel stopped the attack, but it cost him his child. And here's a man that's willing to sacrifice his child for his own benefit, to preserve himself. And you might be thinking, well, this is the modern world. We don't sacrifice children like they did in the Old Testament world. You think so? Consider the woman who sacrifices the bodies of their unborn children so they can keep their job, their scholarship, their boyfriend. Consider parents who abuse and neglect their children because they consider them an unnecessary burden or an expense. 2 years ago, a Hollywood actress named Michelle Williams was receiving a Golden Globes Award. And in her speech, she celebrated the fact that she had an abortion. And in her speech, she said, I could never have won this award had I not aborted my child. One of the most evil things I've ever heard. Her Golden Globe Award was worth more to her than her unborn child. And that's the society in which we live in today. Unfortunately, there are people that celebrate abortion. There's a difference between regretting an abortion and celebrating one. Here's a woman that was celebrating an abortion. And if this is not sacrificing your child to the God of self, I don't know what is. It still goes on today. Philip Ryken wrote, there's a little Misha in every selfish father who gets unreasonably impatient with his kids, and every angry mother who, even for a moment, has ever wanted to strangle her child. May God have mercy on us all. That's a strong word. Now, here's the third final point. In a crisis, some people blame God. Some people turn to their own resources. But here's number 3. Some people turn to God. And this is the right response to a crisis, to get God's directions and do what God says. And so let's go back to the next king, Jehoshaphat, and we see him in verse number 11. But let me tell you a little bit about Jehoshaphat. He was a good and godly king. How do we know that? Well, listen to what the writer of Kings said about him. In 1 Kings 22, verse 43, says this, he walked in all the ways of Asa his father. He turned not aside from it, doing that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away, for the people offered and burned incense yet in the high places. Remember I told you the writer of Kings, he judges every king by the high places. Some king pulled them down. Some kings left them up. Jehoshaphat was a good king, and yet he did not completely eliminate pagan worship from Judah. But he did walk in all the way of Asa, his father, who was a good and godly man. But the best example, I think, of his godliness is how he responds to this emergency. When the troops ran out of water, he didn't panic. Notice his response. Look in verse number 11. But Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not a prophet of the Lord, that we may inquire of the Lord by him?" First thing he does is he says, isn't there a prophet where we can get God's directions? So we learn from Jehoshaphat, seek God immediately. When a crisis comes, seek the Lord. He did not curse God. He did not blame God like Jehoram. He did not rely on his strength and sacrifice his child like Misha did. His first impulse was to turn to God. And again, what a great example for all of us. Now, a servant heard Jehoshaphat's question. So notice how he responds in the second half of verse 11. And one of the kings of Israel's servants answered and said, "Here is Elisha, the son of Shaphat, which poured water on the hands of Elijah." And Jehoshaphat said, "The word of the Lord is with him." So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. And so when this servant reports to Jehoshaphat, "Hey, we have a military chaplain. His name is Elisha." He just kind of tagged along. And let me tell you about him. He is the man, he's the servant that poured water on the hands of Elijah. That was an expression that just simply meant that he served his master Elijah. He did whatever menial tasks that Elijah needed. If Elijah needed dinner, he would fix it. If Elijah needed someone to fetch water, he would do it for him. If Elijah needed someone to pour the water on his hands, he would do it for him. Whatever menial task that needed to be done, Elisha did it for Elijah. He spent all that time with the greatest prophet in Israel, this godly man. So in Jehoshaphat's mind, that had to rub off. And so when he found out that this man served Elijah, his response was, "Well, the word of the Lord is with him. Got to be with him. You can't spend all that time with Elijah and not be a man of God." And by the way, that's still true for ministry today. This is God's pattern for mentorship and ministry. Younger believers can learn a lot from hanging around godly older believers. You can be mentored by godly older saints. And I would to God that we had older saints that would take younger believers under their arms and disciple them and teach them the way of the Lord. And so Jehoshaphat immediately went to this prophet. I love the fact that they didn't call Elisha to come to him. All three of them, when they go down, they go to Elisha. They're standing out, just picture three kings standing out Elisha's tent door there, seeking Elisha the prophet. Seek God immediately, but then seek God sincerely. When they come down, this is when Elisha gives his rebuke in verse 13. Elisha said unto the king of Israel, "What have I to do with thee?" I can just imagine him coming out of his tent, looking and seeing Jehoram and saying, "What do you want here? What do you want with me?" He was kind of irritated with Jehoram because he knew he was an apostate king. He knew that he had rejected the word of the Lord. And so, of course, Jehoram gives his response. The Lord has called these three kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. And verse 14, Elijah said, "As the Lord of hosts liveth, before whom I stand, surely were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not look toward thee nor see thee." Translation, the only reason I'm going to help you is because I like Jehoshaphat. I would never help you. You're an ungodly man. I'd respect Jehoshaphat. The only reason I'm even listening to your request, is because of him. Now, evidently, he was very irritated because they had asked him for a word from the Lord, but his spirit was so irritated at Jehoram, he knew that at that moment, he needed to calm down a little bit before he went to seek the Lord. That ever happen to you? You're a little bit mad, and someone says, "Let's pray together." I'm not ready to pray right now. I'm a little bit mad right now. I need to get into a better frame of mind before I do that. It sounds so pious, so holy. You made me mad, now you want me to pray with you. And so here, this is such an interesting thing here. What does Elisha do? He knows he needs to calm down. And this is such an interesting passage. I'm trying to get, was there any meaning in this? And I read Spurgeon on this. Let me just read you a little excerpt of what the master preacher, the prince of preachers, we call him, Spurgeon, said. Let me just quote him. The prophet evidently was much disturbed in his mind by the sight of the son of Ahab and Jezebel. Elijah never spoke better than when his fiery soul was thoroughly excited. But Elisha was a man of milder mood and a gentle spirit. And therefore, feeling that his blood was hot and his soul stirred, he did not venture to prophesy. He felt within himself, I'm not in the right mood. And if I were to speak, I might utter my own words rather than the words of my master. I feel so angry at the sight of that wicked Jehoram that I might perhaps say what I should be sorry for in the after days. Therefore, Elisha makes a pause. Bring me a minstrel. That is to say, bring me a musician. Get me a musician in here. And then Spurgeon goes on to say that perhaps there was in the camp some Harmon, some Asaph, some sweet psalmist of Israel. And he goes on to say that he perhaps responded, sing me one of the songs of Zion. And when the soft, sweet strain had smoothed the tumult, of his storm-tossed passion, the prophet rose to declare the will of Jehovah. I like that. So when the music begins to play, his spirit is calmed. You know, there's a practical application to this. Good, godly Christian music can minister to the soul, can't it? It can calm your spirit. It can get you in the right frame of mind. And so now that he's in the right frame of mind, the word of the Lord comes to Elisha. Now here's the third thing. Seek God expectantly. Seek God immediately. Seek God sincerely. And then seek God expectantly. God spoke his word to Elisha. Look what he says down in verse 16. And he said, thus saith the Lord, make this valley full of ditches. For thus saith the Lord, ye shall not see wind, neither shall ye see rain. Yet that valley shall be filled with water, that ye may drink, both ye and your cattle and your beasts. And here's God's word. Here's God's direction for this time of crisis. You're in this valley now. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to get out your shovel and dig ditches, because I'm going to send water. And the more ditches that you dig, the more cisterns that you dig, the more water you're going to be able to hold. How much water do you want? Then you start digging ditches. Just keep digging. You're going to need these reservoirs to hold the water that I'm going to send. You know, this reminds me of the Psalm 84:6, where it says, who passing through the valley of Baca make it a well, the rain also fills the pools. Valley of Baca means valley of tears. God said, when you go through the valley of tears, I'm going to fill up the pools there in that valley. And this is what God's going to do to Jehoshaphat. God says, look, I'm going to send a blessing to you. I'm going to send you enough water to feed or to satisfy the thirst of all the armies, of all the cattle, and of all the beasts, all your horses. I'm going to give you more than enough water. And this is God's response. If you're going through a valley, a crisis, God is able to take that valley and fill it with water, pools of refreshing water. You know, so what's the marching orders here, God, from God now? Dig ditches and wait on the Lord. God's going to send a blessing. And you know, what's interesting is here is God saying, look, you do your part, I'm going to do my part. You do your part, you dig the ditches, you obey me and just dig the ditches, and then I will do my part, I will send the blessing. That's a good principle for all of us. And digging ditches really just represents obeying God. You know, you want God's blessing in 2022, you just obey the Lord and you let the Lord send the blessing in. That's what we see here. We dig ditches through the obedience to the commands of the Word of God. If you're in a valley right now, just dig ditches and trust God to send blessing and expect great things from God. And so I want you to notice just three things about this provision. First of all, it was a miraculous provision. So they're out there, they're digging ditches. And then here's what happens. And God says to them in verse 17, for thus says the Lord, ye shall not see wind, neither shall ye see rain, yet that valley shall be filled with water. God says, you know, I'm going to do it without wind. I'm going to do it without rain. I'm just going to send the water. That's going to be the work of God. Can you imagine some of those soldiers out there digging ditches and they're saying, you know, why are we doing this? There's not a cloud in the sky. Well, God said, do it. He said he's going to send us water. He's going to do it without wind. He's going to do it without rain. I can imagine one soldier saying, yeah, we're right, sure. When have we ever gotten water without rain in this dry place? But you know what? Even though the commands of God might not make sense to you, you just need to obey the Lord. You just need to do what God says. How much blessing do you want from God? Well, then just keep digging more ditches. Because when God sends a blessing, you know why sometimes we don't receive the blessing that God sends? We're not ready to receive it. Are we ready to receive blessing? If God wanted to bless you in 2022, would you even be spiritually in the place where you could receive it? Because I want to tell you something, friend. If you're not obeying God, if you're not obeying and doing the things that God, you know that you should be doing before God, how are you going to ever receive the blessing that God has for you? You just need to obey the Lord. This was a miraculous provision. We just do what God tells us and we wait on God. And then this was a mysterious provision. Because it was miraculous, it was also mysterious. The Bible never really tells us where the water came from. It just says it came from a certain direction. You know, what caused this? Where did it come from? I don't know. I don't know. Ever happen in your life? You say, man, I got here. I don't know how I made it this far, but I just know God was with me. I can't write it out. It doesn't make sense to me. There's no formula for it, but I know this. God's been with me this far. It was God's mysterious provision. When I think of this, I think when I was in seminary, you know, when I went through seminary, I was married and had 4 hungry, redheaded kids. And I had to, you know, provide for the family and also go to seminary. Now, in the seminary I went to, you had to pay all of your tuition bill up front before you can go to class for that semester. And so I had to have the money, all of it, for the whole semester up front, you know. And I never missed one semester the whole time I was in seminary. I look back on that. How did I do that? I have no idea how that happened. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I just know God provided. I remember on one occasion when I knew I was $200 short and I was going through the registration line, and I thought, you know, I'm just going to go all the way until they tell me, you know, you can't register. You know, I'm going to dig my ditch. You know, I'm going to do all that I can do until, you know, there's nothing more I can do. So when I got up to the financial part of the registration and I gave the money I had, the lady said, well, you're $200 short. But did you know that just last week a person came by and said, I want to put $200 down on Jerry Harmon's account. And I had exactly what I needed. You know, you just dig the ditch, God will fill it with water. And his provision will be miraculous at times. It'll be mysterious at times. But then this is another thing about God's provision. It'll be a more than provision, I call it, a more than provision. Because look at verse 18. I love this verse. But this is but a light thing in the sight of the Lord. He will deliver the Moabites also into your hand. You didn't ask for this, but you know what else I'm going to do? Not only will I fill your ditches with water, I'm also going to deliver the Moabites into your hand. God is giving them more than they asked for. And I want to tell you something, friend. When a crisis comes and you turn to the Lord with all your heart and you seek him immediately and you seek him sincerely and you seek him expectantly, you know what? God will do more than you think. He'll do more than you ask. God promises that he will give victory. And this is exactly what happened. So as we close, look at how this story ends. In verse 20, and it came to pass in the morning when the meat offering was offered, they always did that in the morning time, that behold, there came water by the way of Edom, and the country was filled with water. And when all the Moabites heard that the kings were come up to fight against them, they gathered all that were able to put on armor upward, and they stood in the border. And they rose up early in the morning, and the sun shone upon the water. And the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. And they said, this is blood. The kings are surely slain, and they have smitten one another. Now therefore, Moab to the spoil. And when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose up and smote the Moabites, so that they fled before them. But they went forth smiting the Moabites even in their country. So what you say, what happens? Well, the next morning, the Moabite army gets up and they see in these wadis, in these little canals, we could say, these little ditches, they see what they think is blood. Now, in their mind, it couldn't be water because everything's dry. There is no water. But it was water. And when they looked at it from their angle with the sun hitting off of that water, it looked to them like it was blood. And so what they thought in their mind was that here, these three kings in this coalition, they turned on one another and they slaughtered one another. And now they're all dead. And the only thing left is to go in and pick up all the spoils. On to the spoils, Moab. So they charged down into the camp thinking they were going to get rich. And they charged into the waiting Israelites, who slaughtered them and defeated them. And God fulfilled his word. God gave the victory. A valley of crisis became a valley of victory. God wants to do for you what he did for Jehoshaphat. He wants to take your crisis, the valley of crisis that you're in, and he wants to bless you, and he wants to give you victory in that. But the question is, how do you respond when a crisis comes? Do you blame God? Do you depend upon your own resources? Or do you turn to God with all your heart? And if you do turn to the Lord and you do pray, just start digging ditches, because God's going to pour out a blessing to you. And I just think, I can just picture in my mind Elisha standing out there the day before, watching them dig ditches, saying, you need to dig some more. This is not enough. How much blessing do you want? Just keep digging. I mean, there's a great host here that needs to be satisfied. Keep digging those ditches. Friend, if you want God's blessing, seek the Lord in your valley and dig ditches, and God will bless you. Let's bow for prayer together tonight. With heads bowed and eyes closed, let me just ask you this as we're praying, finishing up. Is anyone here tonight facing a crisis in your life? Something's happening where you need help. An emergency has come in your life. Crisis has come. Don't blame God for it. Don't turn to your own strength and resources or your own ideas. Humbly, earnestly, sincerely seek the Lord. Ask God for his help. And he's able to take the valley that you're in and fill it with pools of water and give you victory. How many will say, that's my prayer tonight? I'm just coming to the Lord. I'm seeking his wisdom. I'm seeking him to help me in this time in my life. I really need God to really give me direction. Would you say, pray for me tonight, preacher? Would you do that? Just lift your hands. I'll pray for you. Say, that's just me tonight. I need God to help me. God bless you, friends. God bless you. Or maybe you're here tonight, you've never trusted Christ. Let me just extend the invitation to you to reach out in faith and trust in Jesus. Make him your Savior and your Lord. If you'll just pray, Lord Jesus, come into my heart, save me. Sometimes God will bring you into a crisis because he does want to do something new in your life. He wants to save you. He wants to do something new in your soul, cleanse you from your sin and give you eternal life. And friend, if you reach out in prayer, he will save you. Father, I thank you for this story and how it teaches us, encourages us to seek your face. Lord, may we, in a crisis time, immediately turn to you for direction. Ask you for wisdom and guidance. Depend fully, humbly upon you to help us in our valley of crisis. And Lord, turn it into a valley of victory and make us blessed. Give us blessing and victory. We claim it in Jesus' precious name. Amen.